The sound of fizz rose from the metal cup, 1,000 tiny bubbles rushing to the surface like underwater fireworks. Private Marco Bianchi stared in disbelief, transfixed by the dark liquid that seemed to dance in his hands. Around him, dozens of other Italian prisoners fell silent, their eyes locked on the strange black beverage being poured from glass bottles emblazoned with bright red labels. The hiss of carbonation echoed across the mess hall of Camp Shelby, Mississippi, cutting through the humid summer air like whispers from another world. For men who had marched through the scorching North African desert just months before, who had survived on brackish water and wine turned to vinegar, this fizzing American potion seemed almost magical in its strangeness. "Coca-Cola," the American guard announced casually, as if distributing ordinary water instead of what seemed to these prisoners an exotic elixir. Marco brought the cup to his lips hesitantly, his hands trembling slightly. The first sip exploded across his tongue, sweet, sharp, and unlike anything he had ever tasted before. The carbonation burned pleasantly down his throat, making his eyes water. A few prisoners coughed in surprise, while others broke into uncertain smiles. "E medicina?" one man asked. "Is it medicine?" The guard laughed, shaking his head. "Just a drink. Americans have it every day." Every day? Marco looked again at the simple paper cups filled with this strange concoction. In his village outside Napoli, sugar had been strictly rationed since 1940. Even coffee had become a distant memory, replaced by bitter chicory that left a lingering aftertaste. Yet here, in a prison camp thousands of miles from home, American guards were casually distributing this sweet, fizzing beverage as if it were nothing special. As Marco drained his cup, a thought struck him with the same force as the Allied shells that had finally overwhelmed his unit near El Alamein. If this was how Americans treated their captives, what did that say about the nation they had been told was weak, undisciplined, and on the verge of collapse? He glanced around at his fellow prisoners, their expressions mirroring his own confusion. They had expected hardship, perhaps even brutality. Mussolini's newspapers had painted vivid pictures of American barbarism. Yet here they sat, sipping Coca-Cola under electric fans that stirred the summer air. What other surprises awaited them in this strange land where even prison camps seemed to offer comforts beyond what many Italian civilians could access? As the carbonation tickled his nose, Marco wondered, had they been fighting a country far more powerful than they had ever been led to believe? The journey that had brought Marco Bianchi and his fellow Italians to Mississippi had begun months earlier on the burning sands of North Africa. As members of the 10th Army, they had marched proudly under Mussolini's banners, certain of Italy's destiny to reclaim its Roman glory. Military newspapers described Americans as soft, undisciplined soldiers who would break at the first sign of real combat. Officers had reassured them that capture was unlikely, but if it happened, they should expect harsh treatment from the mongrel American forces. When British and American tanks finally broke through their lines in May 1943, panic had spread through the Italian ranks. Stories circulated of mass executions, of prisoners forced to dig their own graves before being shot. Marco remembered the terror that had gripped him when American soldiers surrounded his unit. He had raised his hand slowly, certain he was living his final moments. Instead, the Americans had offered cigarettes and chocolate bars, confusing the Italians with gestures of casual generosity even as they disarmed them. The processing centers had been another shock. Clean water for washing, regular meals of bread and tinned meat, and medical attention for the wounded. Marco had watched in bewilderment as an American medic carefully cleaned and bandaged a fellow Italian's infected foot wound. "Perché?" he had asked. "Why?" The medic had simply shrugged. Standard procedure. There was no propaganda value in this kindness, no photographers, no officers watching. Just routine care that seemed incomprehensible to men who had been abandoned by their own medical services as supplies dwindled in the desert campaign. The voyage across the Atlantic had been long and uncomfortable, with hundreds of prisoners packed into converted cargo ships. Yet even here, the rations had been regular: white bread, coffee with real sugar, and occasionally even fruit. The Americans complain about this food, calling it barely adequate. If this is barely adequate, what must their normal meals be like? It was the first of many questions that would erode the foundations of everything he had been taught about his captors. But nothing prepared the Italians for the strangeness that awaited them when the train finally stopped at Camp Shelby. The compound stretched across acres of Mississippi pine forest, neat rows of wooden barracks with screens on the windows to keep out mosquitoes. Electric lights illuminated the pathways at night, and shower buildings offered hot water every day. The contrast with their field conditions in North Africa could not have been more stark. Many prisoners wondered if this was some elaborate deception, a Potemkin village designed to trick them before the real hardship began. But days passed, then weeks, and the expected cruelty never materialized. Instead, there was order, routine, and perhaps most disorienting of all, Coca-Cola served in the mess hall on Sundays. What sort of nation, Marco wondered, could afford to give prisoners of war a luxury beverage that most Italian civilians hadn't tasted in years? And what did it reveal about the true balance of power in this global conflict they had entered with such confidence and patriotic fervor? The first morning at Camp Shelby had set the tone for the strange new reality the Italian prisoners would inhabit. Reveille sounded at 6, and the men had filed sleepily from their barracks, expecting to be harassed and humiliated. Instead, they found themselves guided to a mess hall where breakfast awaited: oatmeal with milk and sugar, toast with jam, and coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz blends they had grown accustomed to in Italy. The abundance was so shocking that some men hesitated, certain there must be a catch. "Mangia, mangia," a guard encouraged them with mangled Italian. "Eat, eat." Sergeant Paolo Ricci, a schoolteacher from Turin before the war, stared at his tray in disbelief. "This is more food than my family sees in 3 days," he whispered to Marco. "And we are prisoners, prisoners." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. If America could feed its captives this well, what did that say about Mussolini's promises that the United States was a paper tiger, weakened by the Depression and unable to sustain a prolonged war effort? After breakfast came more surprises. The camp's routine included daily showers with soap, regular medical checkups, and work details that were surprisingly light by military standards. Italian prisoners were assigned to kitchen duty, laundry services, or groundskeeping, tasks that kept them busy without exhausting them. Some were even permitted to work on nearby farms, where they encountered another shocking aspect of American life: mechanical abundance. Marco was assigned to a cotton farm, where the owner, a weathered man named Johnson, operated 3 tractors for a plot of land that would have required 20 workers in Italy. "More machines than men," Marco noted in his journal that evening. "One American farmer produces more with his machines than 10 Italian contadini with their hands and backs." The wealth of materials was equally startling. When a tractor belt broke, Johnson simply retrieved a spare from a shed filled with replacement parts. In Italy, such a breakdown might have halted work for weeks while parts were located or improvised. The most profound disorientation, however, came from the casual prosperity evident even in wartime America. On Sundays, when some prisoners were permitted to attend Catholic services in town under guard, they glimpsed American life beyond the camp. Children on bicycles, women in clean dresses without patches or darns, shops with full windows despite rationing. "They have sacrificed nothing," Lieutenant Donatelli muttered bitterly after one such outing, but his words lacked conviction. The evidence of their eyes told a different story. America wasn't sacrificing because it didn't need to. Its abundance was so great that even in wartime, even for prisoners, there remained enough. And then there was the Coca-Cola, the small weekly luxury that perhaps symbolized this jarring reality more perfectly than anything else. The fizzing, dark beverage appeared every Sunday after lunch, poured from bottles that seemed to arrive in endless supply. Guards drank it casually, some not even finishing their portions. To the Italians, this casual waste of sugar and materials was incomprehensible. In Italy, sugar had been strictly rationed since the war began. Coffee had disappeared from civilian shelves, and even wine, the lifeblood of Italian social life, had become increasingly scarce. Yet here was this strange American drink, served to prisoners as if it were nothing special. The Coca-Cola company, they learned, had been granted special dispensation to continue production throughout the war, deemed important for military morale. The sweet, fizzy beverage had become so identified with American culture that ensuring its availability to troops became a military priority, and, by extension, it reached even the prison camps where enemy soldiers were held. How could Italy, with its careful rationing and increasingly desperate shortages, possibly stand against a nation that could maintain such abundance even while fighting across two oceans? The question lingered, unspoken but ever-present, in the minds of men whose certainties were dissolving like sugar in the dark American drink. The first time I tasted Coca-Cola, I thought it must be some American medicine, recalled Corporal Vittorio Esposito, a baker from Sicily who found himself working in the Camp Shelby kitchen. It was so sweet, so strange with its bubbles that burn the throat. We had nothing like this at home, even before the war. Esposito's hands, once skilled at shaping loaves of crusty bread, now operated massive American mixers that produced hundreds of rolls each morning. The scale of everything overwhelmed him. Industrial ovens that could bake 60 loaves at once, refrigerators taller than 2 men, and storage rooms filled with sacks of flour and sugar. In my village, the women wait hours for a handful of flour, he told Marco one evening. Here, I throw away more food cleaning the kitchen than my mother has to cook with for a week. His voice carried no accusation, just a quiet wonder tinged with shame. The prisoners found themselves caught between gratitude for their unexpected comfort and guilt at enjoying it while their families faced increasing hardship back home. For Sergeant Ritchie, the educator whose analytical mind had once taught geography to schoolchildren, the implications were impossible to ignore. "Look at this camp," he said during an evening walk around the perimeter, gesturing at the neat rows of barracks, the electric lights, the clean latrines. "This is not some special showpiece. This is standard American construction, simple, efficient, abundant. They built this camp in weeks using materials they consider ordinary." He pointed to the wooden walkways that kept their feet dry in the rain. "In Italy, this lumber would be precious. Here, it is nothing special." Captain Luca Moretti, the highest-ranking officer in their barracks, maintained a stoic silence during these conversations. A career military man from a family with fascist connections, he struggled visibly with what they were witnessing. "It's all propaganda," he would mutter when discussions turned to American production capacity or the comforts of the camp. "Designed to demoralize us." But his protests grew less convincing as weeks passed. Even he could not deny the evidence before them. The endless supply of food, the medical care that surpassed what Italian civilians received, and the casual technological superiority evident in every aspect of camp life. The guards themselves became another source of disorientation. Rather than the cruel, undisciplined rabble described in fascist propaganda, they were mostly farm boys from Mississippi and Alabama, professional but not harsh. Many spoke some Italian, learned from grandparents or in preparation for the Mediterranean campaign. They shared cigarettes, discussed crops and weather, sometimes even tossed a baseball with prisoners during off hours. Their uniforms were clean, their weapons well-maintained, and most shocking of all, they were well-fed, sturdy men who had clearly never known true hunger. "Guarda come sono alti," Marco overheard an older prisoner saying one day. "Look how tall they are." The Americans towered over most Italians, their physical stature a testament to generations of good nutrition. Even the black American soldiers, whom Italian propaganda had particularly denigrated, displayed the same well-nourished health. It was a walking contradiction to everything the prisoners had been told about American weakness and inferiority. And always, there was that strange dark beverage that appeared each Sunday. Marco began to see the Coca-Cola as more than just a drink. It was a symbol of everything that made America different. Mass-produced, identical in every bottle, it represented standardization and efficiency. Sweet and cold even in summer heat, it demonstrated mastery over environment and material. Available even to prisoners, it revealed an abundance so profound that luxury items remained accessible during wartime. The fizzing liquid in its distinctive bottle had become, for many Italians, their first real understanding of what made the American industrial giant truly formidable. "Do you think we ever had a chance against this?" Marco finally asked Richie one evening, keeping his voice low to avoid being overheard by Captain Moretti. "Against a country that can produce so much that even its prisoners drink Coca-Cola?" Richie's answer was a long time coming. "I think," he said carefully, "that we were fighting a different war than they were. We thought it was about courage and national spirit. They knew it was about production and logistics. And that is why we are here, drinking their Coca-Cola instead of them drinking our wine." The day the Camp Shelby administration announced that Italian prisoners would be permitted to work for pay marked another seismic shift in the captives' understanding of their situation. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could volunteer for labor and receive compensation, in this case 80 cents per day in canteen vouchers. For men who had been soldiers earning meager military wages, the opportunity represented an unexpected chance at small comforts. The canteen itself became a revelation. Shelves lined with cigarettes, soap, writing paper, and small luxuries like chocolate and, yes, bottles of Coca-Cola available for purchase. Marco stared at the neat rows of merchandise, temporarily speechless. An American camp canteen contained more goods than many Italian village shops had seen since 1940. Prisoners formed long lines, clutching their vouchers like precious treasures, debating how to spend their earnings. Some sent money home through International Red Cross channels. Others indulged in small comforts, smoking American cigarettes that were smoother and more plentiful than anything available in wartime Italy. Private Giuseppe Ferraro, a young Calabrian who had worked as a mechanic before the war, spent his first payment entirely on Coca-Cola, purchasing 6 bottles that he carefully arranged beside his bunk. "My brothers will never believe this exists," he said, grinning at Marco. "A drink that bubbles like champagne but costs almost nothing. In America, even common workers must drink like kings." His assessment wasn't far wrong. Coca-Cola had been deliberately priced at 5 cents per bottle for decades, keeping it affordable for ordinary Americans while generating massive profits through sheer volume. The work program revealed another aspect of American life that contradicted fascist narratives. Many prisoners were assigned to local farms and businesses facing labor shortages as American men went to war. There, they encountered civilian life up close, working alongside American women, older men, and teenagers. Marco found himself picking cotton with Mrs. Johnson, the farmer's wife, who operated complex machinery with casual expertise. She spoke little Italian, but managed to communicate through gestures and the few words she knew. During a water break, she showed him a photograph of her son serving in the Navy somewhere in the Pacific. The gesture was startling in its humanity. This woman, whose country was at war with his, sharing something so personal. Most astonishing were the technical capabilities on display, even on remote Mississippi farms. Irrigation systems that delivered water precisely where needed. Radio reports that provided weather forecasts and market prices. Refrigerated storage that kept produce fresh for transport to distant cities. Even the handling of the Coca-Cola that appeared with workers' lunches reflected this technical mastery. Bottles kept cold in electric coolers or ice chests, produced hundreds of miles away, yet arriving perfectly preserved. The scale of American logistics became clearer still when prisoners were taken to work at a railway depot. Trainloads of supplies rolled through daily. Food, equipment, raw materials, and manufactured goods moving in seemingly endless procession across the continent. Marco helped unload crates of Coca-Cola among thousands of other items, the distinctive bottles packed in wooden cases by the hundreds. He calculated quickly. One train car contained enough of the beverage to supply every Italian prisoner in Camp Shelby for months. Yet this was just one small shipment among countless others crisscrossing the country daily. "Do you see now why we are losing the war?" Sergeant Ritchie murmured as they watched another train arrive. "This is not just one train. This happens at every depot, every day, across a nation as large as half of Europe. Italy has courage, tradition, spirit, But America has this. He gestured at the endless flow of material. And this is what decides wars. Captain Moretti, who had been assigned to the same work detail, overheard the remark. For once, he offered no rebuttal. The evidence before them was too overwhelming for even the most dedicated fascist to deny. America's industrial machine operated on a scale that made Italy's efforts seem almost childlike by comparison. The captain simply turned away, his expression haunted, a man watching the collapse not just of military ambitions, but of an entire worldview. That evening, as prisoners gathered in the recreation hall, an American chaplain arrived with something unexpected, a gramophone and records. Music filled the room. Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, Benny Goodman, the swinging American jazz that had been banned in Italy as decadent. Some prisoners looked uncomfortable, but others began tapping their feet. Before long, a few were attempting to dance, laughing at their own awkwardness. The guards watched with amusement, occasionally demonstrating steps. In the corner, Marco noticed several bottles of Coca-Cola being distributed, not the regular Sunday ration, but a special treat accompanying the music night. The dark liquid fizzing in paper cups seemed to perfectly accompany the swinging American rhythms, both modern, both mass-produced, both symbols of a culture that had industrialized even leisure and refreshment. As he sipped his drink, Marco realized that he was developing a taste for it, his palate adapting to the strange sweetness that had initially seemed so foreign. Was this, he wondered, the first step in a larger transformation? The moral crisis came gradually for most prisoners, emerging from the accumulation of small observations rather than any single revelation. For Marco, it arrived on a sweltering August afternoon as he sat in the shade of a pine tree, writing a carefully censored letter home. He had been describing the weather, the work he was doing, assuring his mother and sisters that he was well treated, all permitted topics under camp regulations. What he couldn't write was how the experience had begun to transform his understanding of the world, of the war, and of Italy's place in it. He couldn't tell them that the America he had encountered bore no resemblance to the decadent, chaotic nation described by Mussolini's propagandists. He couldn't explain that even in a prison camp, he ate better than civilians in Naples. He couldn't admit that he had begun to look forward to the weekly Coca-Cola ration, or that he had started to wonder what kind of society could produce such abundance that even its enemies were better fed than his own countrymen. These thoughts felt almost treasonous, yet they persisted, undermining the certainties that had once guided him. Nearby, a heated discussion had broken out among a group of officers.
"We should refuse their comforts," Lieutenant Donatelli was saying, his voice tight with emotion. "Every cigarette we smoke, every Coca-Cola we drink makes us complicit. We become advertisements for American superiority." Captain Moretti nodded in agreement, but Sergeant Ricci shook his head. "Refuse? And what would that prove?" Ricci countered. "That we prefer suffering to comfort? The question isn't why we accept these things. It's why our own leaders couldn't provide them. Why Italy, with all its proclaimed greatness, sent us to war without adequate supplies, while America can afford to feed us better as prisoners than we ate as soldiers." The argument grew more intense. Marco watched as men who had fought together, suffered together in the desert, now turned on each other. Some defended Mussolini passionately, claiming that Italy's sacrifice would ultimately prove more noble than American materialism. Others had clearly begun to question everything about the regime that had sent them to fight in a war they now suspected had been lost before it began. The fracture ran deep, separating those who could adapt their worldview to accommodate new evidence from those who retreated further into dogma when confronted with contradictions. Corporal Esposito from the kitchen crew approached, sitting heavily beside Marco. "I made bread today," he said quietly, "with more wheat flour in a single batch than my village bakery would see in a month. When I think of my mother saving crusts to make bread pudding, while here we throw away entire loaves if they're a day old," he trailed off, the moral weight of the contrast visibly heavy on his shoulders. "Is it wrong that I no longer believe in the cause we fought for? That I look at all this and wonder if Mussolini led us into a war we could never win?" Marco had no answer. He was wrestling with the same questions,
the same guilt at finding comfort in the enemy's abundance, while knowing his family faced increasing hardship. The weekly Coca-Cola had become for him a symbol of this internal conflict, a small pleasure he simultaneously enjoyed and resented, representing both American generosity and the painful recognition of Italy's comparative poverty. Each sweet, fizzy sip carried with it a complex mixture of gratitude and betrayal. That night, unable to sleep, Marco found himself wondering about the America beyond the camp fences. What kind of society had created this industrial colossus capable of fighting a two-ocean war while still producing luxury goods? What values drove a nation that treated its prisoners with standardized decency rather than retribution? And perhaps most troublingly, if he had known the true nature of both America and the war before being drafted, would he have fought at all? These were dangerous thoughts, undermining not just political loyalty, but his sense of identity. Marco had grown up under fascism, educated in its schools, shaped by its youth organizations. To question the regime meant questioning everything that had formed him. Yet here he was, lying on an American-made mattress in a clean barracks, his stomach full of American food, contemplating truths that contradicted everything he had been taught to believe. Across the darkened room, someone whispered a question that captured the collective crisis of faith. If they treat prisoners this well, imagine how they treat their own people. What chance did we ever have against such a country? The question hung in the air unanswered, but its implications echoed through the barracks like the fizz of carbonation in a bottle of Coca-Cola. Subtle but impossible to ignore, slowly changing everything. The arrival of Italian service units marked a profound shift in the prisoners' status. Following Italy's surrender and declaration of war against Germany in 1943, the American government offered Italian POWs the opportunity to volunteer for non-combat service supporting the Allied war effort. Those who accepted would receive increased privileges, better living conditions, and the knowledge that they were now working against their former German allies rather than sitting idle in captivity. The announcement caused tremendous upheaval in Camp Shelby. Men who had fought under the same flag now found themselves making different choices. Their barracks divided between those who signed up for the ISUs and those who remained loyal to fascism despite Italy's official change of allegiance. Captain Moretti led the resistance, calling those who volunteered traitors to the true Italian spirit, even as the new Italian government declared itself the legitimate voice of the nation. Sergeant Ritchie was among the first to volunteer, arguing that Italy's real enemy had always been Nazi Germany, which had exploited Italian resources and lives. Marco found himself torn between these positions. His disillusionment with fascism had grown steadily during his months in America, but the idea of actively supporting the Allied military effort still felt like crossing a significant boundary. What finally decided him was a conversation with Giuseppe Ferraro, the young mechanic who had spent his first earnings entirely on Coca-Cola. "Do you know what happens when you open a bottle of Coca-Cola?" Giuseppe asked him, holding one of the dark glass bottles up to the light. "First, there's that sound, the release of pressure when the cap comes off. Then the fizzing as bubbles escape. If you leave it open too long, it goes flat, loses its spirit." He took a sip before continuing. "Italy was like a sealed bottle for 20 years under Mussolini. Pressure building inside, no release. Now the cap has come off. We have a choice about what happens next." The metaphor struck Marco powerfully. The Italy he had left was not the Italy that existed now. Mussolini had been arrested, then rescued by Germans, only to establish a puppet regime in the north, while the legitimate government joined the Allies. The sealed bottle had indeed been opened, and now each Italian had to decide what that meant for them personally. The next day, Marco added his name to the volunteer roster. Within weeks, he had been transferred to a service unit at Fort Knox, Kentucky, where Italian volunteers maintained vehicles for the U.S. Army. The contrast with traditional POW status was immediate and stark. ISU members wore uniforms with Italy patches, ate in American messes, received regular pay, and enjoyed significantly more freedom of movement. Most notably, they were treated not as captives, but as co-belligerents, Allied fighters in the struggle against Nazi Germany. Marco's first day at Fort Knox brought another encounter with American abundance that dwarfed even his experiences at Camp Shelby. The motor pool contained hundreds of vehicles, tanks, jeeps, trucks, all in various stages of maintenance. Tools that would have been precious treasures in Italy hung on pegboards by the dozens. Spare parts filled warehouse shelves. And in the workshop refrigerator, bottles of ice-cold Coca-Cola awaited the workers. No longer a weekly treat, but a daily refreshment. Americans don't even think about it, said Domenico Longo, another Italian volunteer who had been at Fort Knox for several months. For them, Coca-Cola is like water, always available, always the same, no matter where you buy it. Do you know they have plants producing it all across America, all using the same secret formula? Even during wartime, they never stopped making it. He shook his head in wonder. In Italy, every village has its own wine, its own cheese, all different, all special to that place. Here, they make everything the same, but they make so much of it that everyone can have it. Working alongside American mechanics revealed other aspects of the culture that had created such material abundance. There was a practical emphasis on efficiency, on finding the quickest solution rather than the most elegant. There was little concern for hierarchy. A sergeant would listen to a private suggestion if it might save time or improve results. And there was an almost religious respect for standardization, for interchangeable parts and repeatable processes. These values, Marco realized, extended beyond mechanical work to shape every aspect of American life, from the identical Coca-Cola bottles to the grid pattern of city streets to the standardized houses sprouting in new developments. It was a fundamentally different approach to civilization than Italy's emphasis on artisanal craftsmanship, regional variation, and historical continuity. Neither approach was inherently superior, but in the context of modern warfare, the American system had proven devastatingly effective. One evening, an American sergeant invited several of the Italian volunteers to his home for dinner, an unprecedented level of trust and integration. Marco found himself seated at a table with the sergeant's family, eating pot roast and mashed potatoes while the sergeant's children peppered him with questions about Italy. The meal concluded with apple pie and, predictably, bottles of Coca-Cola all around. As Marco watched the sergeant's wife pour the dark liquid over ice cubes, another casual luxury, he was struck by the realization that this ordinary American family enjoyed comforts that would have seemed almost aristocratic in his village. Their modest home had electric appliances, indoor plumbing, and a refrigerator stocked with food. Their children were well-fed, well-dressed, and expected to attend high school and perhaps even college. Yet this was not a wealthy family by American standards, just typical working-class people whose basic standard of living exceeded what many Europeans could imagine. "Your Coca-Cola," Marco said, raising his glass in a small toast. "I think it tells the whole story of America. Mass-produced, but high quality. The same everywhere, but always satisfying. A luxury that has become ordinary." He took a sip, the familiar sweet fizz now a comfort rather than a shock. "We in Italy thought we were fighting a nation of soft, decadent people. We never understood that your strength comes precisely from this ability to make good things abundant, to turn luxuries into everyday experiences." The sergeant seemed surprised by the observation, then thoughtful. "Never really considered Coke that way," he admitted. "It's just a drink to us. But I guess you're right, there is something American about it." He raised his own glass. "To Italy and America, fighting together now." As Marco returned to the base that night, he found himself contemplating how completely his worldview had transformed. From a young Italian soldier indoctrinated in fascist ideology to a volunteer working alongside Americans. From a man who had first tasted Coca-Cola as an exotic shock to someone who now drank it casually with dinner. The journey represented more than just changing sides in a war. It was about understanding a different vision of what modern society could be, one based on abundance rather than sacrifice, standardization rather than tradition, practical effectiveness rather than aesthetic perfection. He wondered how he would explain all this when he eventually returned to Italy, how to convey to family and friends that the America he had discovered bore no resemblance to the caricature they had been taught to despise. How could he describe the revelation of seeing Coca-Cola served even in prison camps, a symbol of industrial might so secure that it extended its comforts even to captured enemies? Would they understand the profound message contained in that simple act? The confidence of a nation that knew its strength lay not in cruelty or deprivation, but in the overwhelming productive capacity that made generosity possible even in wartime. As the European conflict ground toward its inevitable conclusion, Marco and his fellow Italians in the service units followed the news of Italy's liberation with complex emotions. Joy at the defeat of fascism mingled with concern for family members caught in the fighting, pride in Italy's new democratic direction tempered by awareness of the tremendous rebuilding that would be needed. Reports from home painted a picture of a devastated nation, cities bombed, infrastructure destroyed, food scarce, and political divisions running deep. By contrast, America remained untouched on its home soil, its factories running at full capacity, its supermarkets stocked, its children safe. The Italian volunteers, now familiar with both worlds, understood better than most the vast gulf in resources and capabilities that had determined the war's outcome long before the first shots were fired. Many began planning how they might carry American methods and approaches back to help rebuild their shattered homeland. In May of 1945, as victory in Europe was officially declared, the base commander organized a celebration. The service unit members stood alongside American soldiers, watching as flags were raised and speeches delivered. Afterward, trucks arrived carrying iced tubs filled with, what else, bottles of Coca-Cola for everyone present. Marco accepted one, the glass cool against his palm, the familiar logo as recognizable to him now as any symbol from home. Standing in the Kentucky sunshine, surrounded by men who had begun as his captors and somehow become his colleagues, Marco contemplated the journey that had brought him here. The fear of capture, the shock of unexpected decent treatment, the gradual erosion of everything he had believed about America, and finally, the strange transformation into something neither fully Italian nor American, but somewhere in between. A man who could see both worlds with new clarity. As peace settled over a devastated Europe and plans began for Italian prisoners to return home, Marco wondered what other former enemies would experience in the years to come.
Would bewunden prisoners kehren similäre Revolutionen back zu ihrem shattered country? Would japanische Kaptive rückkehren mit Stories von amerikanischer Abundanz, das kontradiktete imperiale Propaganda? Und how würden diese Erfahrungen die Post-War World gestalten, als Nationen einst locked in Mortal Kombat den Slow-Prozess der Rebuilding Relationships begannen? Perfide, meist profunde Legacies von Krieg waren oft nicht aufgefunden auf Battlefields oder in Peace Treaties, sondern in diesen Quiet Moments auf kultureller Encounter. Wenn ein simples Bottle von Coca-Cola served to enemy prisoners, beginnt der erste Schritt in einem anderen Weg von Organisieren sozialer System. Für in diese Small Encounters zwischen ordinary people wir oft finden die true foundation für lasting peace. Die recognition of our shared humanity amid der artificial divisions of conflict und die Hoffnung, dass prosperity might someday become not a weapon of war, but a universal birthright, as common und accessible als ein sweet fizzy drink enjoyed auf einer Summer afternoon.